Good evening. Welcome to part 3 of this session. How's everyone doing?
Doing fine.
Okay, thank you.
Good.
Cheryl Bellamy.
So I'm gonna, as soon as I can find it, good, yeah, I found it. First things first, I'm gonna put in the chat box the link to the source sheet I'm working off of this evening. Again, sometimes people like to print it out. Sometimes people like multiple screens. I'll share the screen and manipulate the text so that we'll have a common thing we can work on. But just to sort of set the stage, right? 2 weeks ago, we looked through biblical texts, biblical from our perspective, right? Hebrew Bible texts about messianism, and again asserted pretty clearly that certainly by the end of the biblical period, we have this somewhat fixed collection or spectrum of messianic ideas. We have this notion of Davidic line. We have a kind of redemptive political arc. We have certainly, because of that Davidic arc, a kind of notion of the Messiah as a warrior king of sorts. And maybe this is why, as we'll think about next week, why the Bar Kokhba revolt has its own kind of messianism there. And Bar Kokhba is certainly a military leader and a military political figure. We don't see much of what I think many people associate with a kind of normative Christian messianism, which is the divinity of the Messiah, the notion that somehow the Messiah is part of the Godhead or something like that. That does not really appear in Hebrew Bible text, at least not explicitly in any kind of way. And so I guess what I want to think about tonight is, how do we get from this movement in the 30s around one of many charismatic leaders or charismatic people in this very heady time in Jewish history, to the kinds of Christological claims that we see in the New Testament. And I tried last week to sort of present a little bit of the Gospels, how they work, how they differ from one another, a little bit of their dating. And if you recall, I was at great pains to try to argue that the Gospels are pretty late as we have them. That is, even though they depict events of the late 30s, at the earliest, they're written just after the destruction of the temple in 73, and maybe even a little bit later. And that's even the earliest of the Gospels. That's Mark, and that Luke and Matthew, which rely on Mark and other stuff, as we saw last time, are later still. And in this way, even though when you open up a volume of the New Testament, right, it's always the Gospels which come first and only afterwards the letters of Paul, in some sort of historical sense, it ought to be the other way around, because Paul's letters date from the 50s. They're much earlier than even the earliest of the Gospels. What just sprung to mind was we just made a hire in our department of a scholar of New Testament and early Christianity. And the question that I was encouraged to ask when on the committee of interviewing a bunch of people for this position, because we're a Jesuit Catholic school, teaching an introduction to the New Testament is a big part of this new professor's job description. And so I was always encouraged to ask, how will you set up your course, Intro to the New Testament? And each scholar, both the fine scholar Tom Blanton, who eventually got the job, and others, were at pains, really made a point of arguing, oh, I teach this course in the order in which the books are printed in the Bible, or I teach them in historical order. But everybody made a point of answering my question by addressing precisely this issue and the lateness of the Gospels. And so I think in order to sort of both answer the question, what actually happened in the 30s, and the question, why is it that these texts reflect a particular kind of messianic approach, I think it's before we sort of look at more New Testament texts in detail, I want to just sort of sketch out the theory that I'm kind of working with. And I'm drawing very, very explicitly on Paula Fredrikson's excellent book, which is called When Christians Were Jews, which is available wherever books are sold. And Fredrikson paints a very compelling picture, which I'm going to sort of sketch out first, and then we're going to look at texts in detail. So she argues that in the original Jesus movement, there is not explicit claims of messiahship, okay? That Jesus is primarily a charismatic teacher and healer, which is a normal thing in first century Judea. That now centuries of Roman colonial rule have made life rather unpleasant for the Judean population. And thus, anytime you have a charismatic teacher who, along with teaching the Torah, as we might think about it, is also preaching the end of the world, or at the very least, the end of the Roman Empire's political control over Judea. And given how powerful the Romans were, really the only comparable model to the power of the Roman Empire was either the height of the British Empire or perhaps the American military in our own in our own era, right? In order to imagine the overflow of Roman military might, right, you have to sort of assume the end of the world. Now, once you have a charismatic teacher, excuse me, proclaiming the end of the world, it's only natural for people to say, maybe this is the Messiah, right? So whereas the leadership of the movement or the people in the inner circle may not have been making particular kind of messianic claims, of course it makes sense that if somebody is preaching the end of the world, that, well, hey, could be the Messiah. Well, there, of course, is a crisis, because one Passover, we don't know exactly what Passover it is, this group and this charismatic teacher finds their way to Jerusalem, along with thousands, if not millions of other people. Among the things that Herod's redo of the temple enabled was many, many, many more people to be there. As I'm sure many people know, in the first century, Herod's rebuilding of what we call the Second Temple was to that point the largest construction project ever undertook by human beings, right? And right, and it's still there, basically 2,000 years later, which testifies, and I suspect all of us have been there, or at least have seen pictures of it, right? The stones of what we call the Kotel are massive, right? And the fact that this building project, when you see it from the Google Earth view, right, it's still there, and it's massive. And even these massive 7th century Muslim structures, the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, which are pretty big, right? When seen from the air, they are pretty small things on top of the Temple Mount, which just shows exactly how many people. I mean, think about, I guess our own experience is probably, football stadiums or sort of things on that massive, massive scale that hold thousands and thousands and thousands of people. So you have Jesus and the followers showing up in the temple one Passover, and for some reason, this leader ends up killed, right, executed by the Romans. Okay? And the reason why the Romans would have executed somebody really is only for political reasons. The Romans had no interest in interfering with intramural Jewish debates between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. It's true that the temple and that the high priesthood is in some way a political appointment, but in general, the Romans really didn't care who was saying what in a kind of religious sense. But presumably, if you start saying that you're going to overthrow the Roman Empire, well, that's the kind of thing that's gonna get you killed. And crucifixion is a normative mode of Roman execution. It's incredibly gruesome. It's also incredibly effective, right? If you are walking down the street and you see a whole bunch of people, right, who are dead already or dying in this incredibly embarrassing and painful and horrible way, you're probably going to think twice about doing whatever it was that got those folks killed in that way. Well, if the community imagined that they were going to Jerusalem to experience the end of the world, maybe some of them the messianic redemption, and suddenly the leader is killed, right? That puts something of a damper on the movement, right? And this is the normative way that most other messiahs in Jewish history have gone down. Bar Kokhba, as we'll think about a little bit next week, the Yerushalmi tells us that Rabbi Akiva himself said, here goes the Messiah, and yet a Beitar is destroyed and Bar Kokhba is killed, and the response is, oops, I guess not, right? And if you think about Shabtai Tzvi, when Shabtai Tzvi in the 17th century eventually converts to Islam, Jews around the world, yeah, there's a crisis because many people assumed that the Messiah was here, but when you convert to Islam, well, I guess you weren't the Messiah, too bad. And I suspect it's probably still a little too soon to say this with any kind of certainty, since it's only been about 30 years. But when the Lubavitcher Rebbe died, right, though many Lubavitchers assumed, okay, we're living in the Messianic era, the majority of Lubavitchers, clearly there are some who continue to ascribe to Menachem Mendel Schneerson messianic traits, but the majority seem to think, oops, I guess it didn't happen. It could have been, but it didn't work out. So I guess the question is, what makes Jesus of Nazareth different? Right? Why is it that there are still today people we call Christians, where there is nobody today who asserts that Bar Kokhba really was the Messiah? Or it's possible that there are Sabbateans in some kind of sense, but certainly not. There aren't massive numbers of Sabbateans out there. So what makes this Jesus movement different in any way? And that's really the task for today. But it would seem that this group had this amazing ability to recast their messianism, right? And the argument that is made in the Gospels, as we'll see, is it's not that Jesus was the Messiah so much as that when Jesus comes back, he will be the Messiah. That redemptive turn is pushed from the past to the future. Okay, and in some ways, Fredrickson is really arguing that this is the way that this community was able to understand the execution of their leader and to reinterpret it in light of biblical texts they were familiar with in order to say, okay, he wasn't the Messiah when he was here, because the Messiah can't die, be killed by the empire he's supposed to overthrow, but he's coming back. The end of the world really is soon. And it's pretty clear that from Paul's letters that Paul too thinks that the end of the world is going to happen in his lifetime. And the sort of second stage, which is so interesting, is how did it go from the end of the world is happening now to the end of the world is sometime in the far off future. But it's that move from now to soon, to eventually, which is the sort of arc that the early Christian movement has to go through before finally settling on a kind of theology that can take it. And we all must admit, despite the consequences for Jewish history, that this Jesus movement has been incredibly successful, right, over the last 2,000 years, right? I don't know exactly how many Christians there are on the earth, but there's certainly a lot, right? And that's pretty amazing that this small group was able to withstand the totally unexpected death of their leader and to really thrive in pushing their message all the way around the world. So that's my introduction. We'll look at texts in a second, but before we do that, I just want to sort of to take the pulse and see if there are any sort of broad questions about the theory first, before we delve into some more New Testament texts. No pressure, but happy to entertain questions before I move on.
Of course, they got a big boost from Constantine.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And we'd have to we'll have to think a great deal about this. I mean, among the things that changes right before then is that it seems that this movement doesn't have all that much success with ethnic Judeans, right? Whom we would call Jews. They have a great deal of success with non-ethnic Judeans. And that, if that's owing to Paul or the community that Luke seems to be representing, this is another sort of key to the story. And I wish we knew more about this, but presumably the destruction of Jerusalem plays a big, heavy role in this, that the Jerusalem church, led by members of Jesus's own family, seems to go up in the same flames as everything else in 70 to 73 during the Great Revolt. And that leaves a sort of paucity of knowledge about this early community of people we might call Jewish Christians. And you're absolutely right that when in the 4th century, Constantine is able to, in some sense, convert the empire to Christianity, that is a very different kind of situation than what had happened a few hundred years earlier.
And may I remind David, it's not just Constantine, but wasn't his mother Helena helped by going around Jerusalem and identifying all those centuries later where all the key things happened?
Indeed.
Absolutely.
Indeed, right? And she seems to have used the very important method of, right? That is to say, so many of these sites are, we have no reason in any historical or archaeological sense of trusting. And yet, I mean, this is true of our own landmarks as well. The notion that Rachel's tomb is really Rachel's tomb, or even the Cave of the Patriarchs, or, any of these kinds of sites. I remember going once to Kever Shmuel, right? To the cave of the prophet Samuel. And of course, there are 2 graves there. And every Israeli tour guide tells the same joke when asked, how come there are 2? He says, well, this is Shmuel Aleph and that's Shmuel Bet, right? The first book of Samuel and the second book of Samuel. So I got 2. All right, so it's a sort of silly tour guide joke, but it shows that we don't really have data about these things. Later people say this is where it happened. It's associated with it. Aside from the temple, and I think this is sort of an interesting mark of Jewish history, we don't care so much where things happen, right? There's no Jewish attempt in history to identify where Mount Sinai is. It's not important where it was. It's important the content that was transmitted there. And similarly, maybe the Tomb of the Patriarchs for some is a good counter example. But aside from that, there has not been so much of an attempt to do this.
Rebecca's tomb also.
Yes, exactly. Well said. That's right. But again, I think many of these things are much later identifications. Okay, so I am going to share my screen, and hopefully everybody can see this. So what I want to try to do is take us, Barry, did you have a question?
Just very quickly, it's a pleasure to be learning with you. I happen to be in Kansas City. I'm a former Clevelander. My family was a member of this synagogue. You might have touched on this. I apologize if I missed it. We talk about Mashiach within Judaism. We talk about Messianism in Christianity. And I know it's not the main focus of this series, but did you mention, or can you mention just briefly, the idea of Messianism beyond this so-called Abrahamic grouping of religions, because I've studied religion quite a bit myself. And the more you speak, I get more curious as to what was there that prevented, right, Messianic traditions in other religions, or if they exist, what's prevented us from hearing more about them? And I don't want to take you off track.
No, it's a good question. I mean, I think if we use the term messianism, the fact that that's a loan word from Hebrew, right? I mean, as we saw a couple of weeks ago, that this doctrine of anointing and the way that anointing is particularly associated with the temple. And then we have this sort of Deuteronomic historian association with King David, who is some way the builder of the temple and the anointing of him as king, right? Which makes this in many ways uniquely an Israelite phenomenon. Now, of course, the outside influence of the Hebrew Bible on both Christians and Muslims lead to a kind of messianism in those traditions. It's certainly possible to play the sort of comparative religion game of sort of looking in other traditions to try to see about thinking about the future and parallels. Of course, that game's a sort of dangerous game to play. And, you know, within the academy, in my field these days, the sort of notion of comparative religion is kind of on the outs. Because so much of the premise is that all religions must work in the same way, but that really is looking at the world through Christian goggles, right? Even the whole notion of religion as such is something that sort of seems to be native only to the West. And therefore trying to sort of decide what it is that you're going to compare. Oh, I found this in the near situation, and there's something similar over there in the other. Well, in many ways, that's the creation of the scholar, right? Deciding to privilege similarity over difference has led to a lot of people thinking that kind of comparative model really doesn't yield as many fruits. That is, it says more about the person doing the comparing than it does about the things being compared. So I'm not exactly sure. I do think that when we talk about messianism particularly, right, I do think among the gifts of the Hebrew Bible that it has bequeathed to the world for good and bad is this notion of messianism, right, which really isn't a first order native category outside of that community. Okay. So what I want to do is show you some passages from the Synoptic Gospels, which I think we need to read sort of in two ways simultaneously. One, because they might give us some actual historical data about the 30s and the original Jesus movement, but might also display the ways in which later generations have read messianism back onto the texts, onto the story as we have it. And among the great insights of the sort of historical Jesus movement is a couple of claims that some things really must be historically true, because if they weren't, nobody would make them up. Okay. And maybe first among this is this notion that Jesus of Nazareth gets toiveled, I guess we would say in our locution, right, gets baptized by Yochanan HaMatbil, by the person who's normally referred to as John the Baptist, right? If you were the disciple of a particular sage, you probably wouldn't represent the notion that your sage, your master, was in some sense subservient to some other master. Right? If you think your master is really the greatest there is, why would you tell a story about how your master showed himself to be the disciple of, in some sense, somebody else? Right? And the fact that all of the Gospels seem to be totally open about this suggests that indeed there was some connection between the movement around John the Baptist and the Jesus movement. Now, we know something about John the Baptist. Josephus, who, as I showed last week, may say nothing, but probably says a little bit of something about Jesus of Nazareth, says a great deal more about John the Baptist. And from everything we seem to know about John the Baptist seems to be related ideologically, if not literally related, to the people whose books we found at Qumran, who too are worried about the end of the world. As I like to joke, right, the reason why they ran away to these caves near the Dead Sea is that they were so convinced that the holidays were being celebrated on the wrong days in Jerusalem, right? They have a different calendar, and therefore, when the big lightning bolt was going to hit the temple, they didn't want to be anywhere near it, right? And instead wanted to live this kind of ascetic life outside the precincts of Jerusalem. It seems that John the Baptist either studied at Qumran or was affiliated with the Essenes, seems to be part of this community, and is preaching the end of the world and is insisting that everybody behave, right, as if they were in the temple, even though they're not in the temple, okay, which is later on, of course, a normative part of rabbinic Judaism. I mean, so much of what we do every Friday night and washing our hands and behaving at the temple as if it were an altar is a way of saying, even though we don't have the temple anymore, we can sort of pretend we can live as if we lived in the temple. In the ancient world, aside from the issues of what we call Toharat HaMishpacha, Hilchot Nida, the laws of sexuality during menstruation, right? Aside from that, there is no reason to be ritually pure unless you need to go to the temple. Sheila, hold on one second. Let me just finish the thought. Right? It is not asur, it's not prohibited to be tameh, to be unclean. If you touch a dead body, okay, you've touched the dead body and now you're unclean. It has no impact on your life unless you need to go to the temple. If you're a priest and you're offering sacrifices, they must be offered in a state of ritual purity. If you're going to the temple, you have to go to the mikveh beforehand. But in your normal, everyday Judean life, being impure is no big deal. But if you're preparing for the end of the world, or if you're imagining a kind of spiritual temple outside the temple, well, now it makes sense to find the biggest mikvah you can find and get yourself dunked in it, right? And that seems to be exactly what John the Baptizer is doing. Yeah, Sheila, go ahead.
I remember way back when I was in Hebrew school, I remember the revelation that Jesus was Jewish. I mean, this was a big shock. That's because my Hebrew teacher was at the seminary, so he knew something. But I also recall somehow thinking that I heard that Jesus was considered an Essenian.
Well, so considered by whom? I mean, first of all, nowadays, we seem to think that the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls happened a long time ago. And I guess in some ways that's true. But research into the Dead Sea Scrolls and their meaning is still in its infancy. I mean, this is among the major questions of this time. We have no way of answering that with any kind of surety. As I've been trying to point out, we can't really make 100% clear claims about the historical Jesus because these texts are from so much later. I think the contemporary scholarly sense is it's less that Jesus himself was an Essene or was a member of that community, and more that the influence comes from John the Baptist, right? And that the claims that are being made today is that it's really John the Baptist who has this connection with the Essene community. Yeah.
Well, Aya wants to ask him. We're together.
Good. I just can't, I'm having trouble hearing.
My understanding of the association of Jesus and Mary with the Essenes is that in terms of the celibacy and Mary in particular, that you have the, that she must be a virgin, that part of it is, of course, if you're Catholic, sex is dirty, but if you're Paul, sex is even worse. But why does Mary have to be a virgin? Why does she have to, in theory, stay a virgin? Because she was celibate, she was an Essene, so that has to be dropped into the picture.
Yeah, it's a reasonable point, and certain of the Qumran texts seem to suggest that celibacy, either your whole life or maybe just part of your life, is important. Here's where the archaeology and the ideology of the text don't always line up. The first generation of archaeologists assumed that all of the skeletons to be found in the community were male, but when you did the DNA analysis and you look at the hips carefully, it seems that some of them came from people who had uteruses and had given birth. And so it may well be that the Essenes weren't as celibate as maybe we were led to believe. And so all of this is very complicated. The connection between the archaeology of the site of Qumran and the texts found in their library don't always seem to line up. It's possible. I guarantee that there are books in the Bnei Yeshurun library which don't conform to the theology of the conservative movement. Does that mean that Bnei Yeshurun is some sort of bizarre sect of conservative Judaism in the 21st century? Or no, it may just show that people have books in their libraries because people want to read things even if they don't necessarily agree with them. And so the answer is we really just don't know. Yeah, Taibo.
But some of it is, because I think, and it's a little bit of chutzpahdik for me to say this to you teaching a class, given that you're at John Carroll, but some of it I think is we anachronistically assume that what we think of as the Roman Catholic Church, for example, papal infallibility is what, 200 years old, 300 years old? Immaculate Conception being not Jesus but Mary, I forget how old that is. Yeah. There are all these things where if we look at, not even saying Protestant, but look at Roman Catholic and think that we can interpret what that means. The church, any religious institution would take a long time to coalesce, but in particular, anyway, I'll stop because you're the academic.
I'm nodding. I think you're absolutely right, and it's almost a cliche in Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship that people see what they want to see. That Jewish scholars show up there and say, "Aha, it's a Beit Midrash," and Catholic scholars say, "Aha, it's a scriptorium," right? And that's so much, as you say, of what scholars themselves do is to retroject their own assumptions about what must be onto what is, and that's very, very dangerous. Okay. Yeah, Sheila, last comment, and then we're actually going to look at this text.
One comment about where you said that, yes, they found female hips.
Yes.
That doesn't mean that they gave birth. They could have still been celibate. We have the Shakers.
Yes, but there are but these, and I'm drawing just on the research of Tali Lan here. I'm not an archaeologist and I don't know, but I believe that archaeologists frequently make claims by looking at the hip bones and can determine whether or not a baby's head passed through those hips, right? It's not just that they belonged to women, it's that they belonged to women who had birthed. And I think we'll leave it at that. That book, Tali Lan's wonderful, wonderful book, is called Integrating Women into Second Temple History. And I recommend it very, very highly. It has the best treatment of all the Bruria texts anywhere in the scholarly literature, and it's definitely worth owning. Okay, so here once again we've got the synoptic gospels here. Once again, Mark is likely the earliest, but you can see all of these traditions coalescing. Right? In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. Okay, that seems okay. John, now only Matthew adds the following. John would have prevented him by saying, I need to be baptized by you. And do you come to me? Okay, to some degree, I think this is the response to the claim that I spoke about just a few minutes ago, right? There's some kind of angst at this community. If our guy is the real guy, why was he subservient to somebody else, right? And that question is almost retrojected into the mouth of John the Baptist, right? And so John is stating this concern. I'm not good enough to do this to you. You should be doing it to me. But Jesus answered him, let it be so now, for it is proper for us in this way to fulfill all righteousness. Then he consented, right? So if our guy was in fact the superior sage, well, they must have had a conversation about it, and here it is. Okay? And when Jesus had been baptized, just as he came up from the water, suddenly the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. It's interesting. Of like a dove is interesting and unique to Matthew. Okay, and a voice came from heaven: "You are my son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." Okay, so there's a very, very famous line in the Gospels. What's interesting is it seems to be a shiluv, a sort of mashup of two different verses. Okay, one is a verse we saw ourselves 2 weeks ago from Yeshayahu. Okay, here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. Okay, this is one of the so-called servant songs in this section of 2nd Isaiah. And as I said last time, right, the messianism of this verse is, well, long predates the Jesus movement. Here we have the Targum, the Aramaic translation, right, which translates Avdi, my servant, which probably in the plain sense of Isaiah means the community of the Israelites, God's servant, but is here interpreted as Avdi Mashiach, my servant, the Messiah. This is not a Christian text. This is a Jewish Targum, and yet the messianism associated with this verse seems to predate the movement. So if you're looking for a verse to quote or to sort of hint towards, this is the perfect one, because it's already got messianic overtures here. And you could see how a story about the baptism might have been presented once upon a time as just part of the story, and yet this moment then, from a later perspective, has the messianism sort of grafted onto it. Okay, and furthermore, right, this psalm very much associated with David, right? The notion that God is talking and calling David, or the author of the song, B'ni ata, you are my son. I've given you Rashi here just for fun, right? B'ni ata, you are my son. Rosh Yisrael, hakurin b'Torah b'ni, b'chori, right? God says, B'ni b'chori Yisrael. You, O Israel, are my son, my firstborn. This whole notion of sonship, we could do a whole class on this. But this goes back all the way to the ancient Near East. If you look at the Suzerain treaties, which are probably the best the ancient Akkadian and Sumerian treaties, which are probably the best cultural model for the covenant at Mount Sinai, they always have the big son, the big king saying to the lesser king who is accepting his vassal status and agrees to pay all kinds of money in order to be protected by the big king. The big king says, I will treat you as my son, right? Is that a genetic thing? No, right? It's a metaphor for the relationship between the more powerful political authority and the less powerful political authority. And that's clearly what's going on in the Hebrew Bible, that David is the little king, the earthly king, and God is the heavenly king. And that relationship between the heavenly king and the earthly king is kind of like the same relationship between the Akkadian, right? The big Mesopotamian king and the lower vassal king. Okay, and yet it then gets mapped onto this, and you can see how the Christology and the theology can go off to the races from there. Okay, moving on, the question is really, what did Jesus preach in the 30s? And well, we don't know exactly, but Jesus hears that John has been arrested. right? The Romans don't like the fact that there's this big movement baptizing themselves and proclaiming the end of the world. And so John is beheaded, okay? From that time, reading from Matthew here, Jesus began to proclaim, repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near. Okay? Or in Mark, the time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God has come near. Repent and believe in the good news. Right? Luke doesn't have anything like this, simply began to teach in the synagogues. Okay, so what is going on? I think many scholars assume that what Jesus is preaching is the end of the world is coming. The end of the world is coming. Get your affairs in order that the end of the world is coming, which is very different from saying, I am the Messiah. I'm going to overturn the Roman Empire and usher in the end of the world. No, just simply, I am the prophet that the end of the world is coming. Okay. You might think that somebody who actually thought he was the Messiah would have been raising troops to lead the rebellion. God's on our side. We're going to beat up the Roman Empire, right? We're going to overthrow the empire. We don't see anything like that. Instead, we see this proclamation of the end of the world and doing precisely the kinds of things that first century sages do, right? You go to shul and you teach. We don't know exactly what synagogues were like at this time, regardless. I mean, most of our later Jewish data, which is mostly collected in Masechet Megillah, right? The Mishnah, which delineates many of the Torah readings, but not all of them, comes from the 3rd century, right? Comes from almost 200 years after these events. So and many years after the destruction of the temple. So we're not quite sure. We know that there were synagogues from archaeology. Many of you have probably been to the synagogue on Masada, which was built while the temple still stood. Prayer is certainly a thing, as we know from Daniel and other first century books, but exactly what that prayer looked like, exactly what things were read, we simply don't know. Okay. The other thing we think we know about the historical Jesus is that in addition to being an itinerant preacher of the end of the world, Jesus seems to have been a healer, which was totally normative in first century Judea. Exactly what we might mean by possessed by demons in the ancient world and how we might imagine that in contemporary society, I don't know. But especially for people who are older than I am, our new discourse of mental health, right? And people struggling with severe mental health issues is a totally new discourse of explaining why people act in ways that we find strange. And we have all kinds of both medical and non-medical ways of helping people cope with these experiences. Is it possible that this is exactly what's going on, that what was explained in the ancient world by being possessed by a demon is what we today would call severe mental health challenges or something like that? There's no reason why we couldn't assume that an incredibly charismatic person might be able to help people in that regard. And we have hundreds and hundreds of examples of people like this who are able to do this kind of thing, right? So I'll read from Mark here. That evening at sunset, they brought to him all who were sick or possessed by demons, and the whole city was gathered around the door, and he cured many who were sick with various diseases. Okay. Matthew alone here uses a proof text from Isaiah. Right? Yet another one of these servant songs, which seems in the plain sense of Isaiah to be about the whole community of Israel. But once we have decided that there's a kind of messianic way of interpreting these verses in Isaiah, well, it makes sense, especially for Matthew, who's speaking to a Judean audience. Aha, let's relate yet another, presumably, a text that has already been associated with messianism. Let's port it here because it makes perfect sense. Okay. Now, and cast out many demons, I'm reading from Mark, and he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. What does that mean? Well, if it's really true that Luke has Mark before him, okay, may well be that we have the interpretation of Mark here in Luke. Demons also came out of many shouting, "You are the Son of God." Okay, again, related to this sonship model that we've seen before. But he rebuked them and would not allow them to speak because they knew that he was the Messiah. Right? Why would Jesus not let them proclaim that he's the Messiah? If that's part of the job that he's doing here, is to announce that he is the Messiah now, well, why not? Why does he have to shush the demons and not allow them to say this? Okay? We see the same thing a little bit later on. Okay, Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea, right? And on the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered, "John the Baptist, others Elijah, others of the prophets." Okay, so it seems if we were to take this as a little bit of a historical kernel, people who are excited know that he's important, right? But exactly which important figure this is, people don't quite know. Okay. He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." Okay, and we see this in all three. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God, the Messiah of God. And in parallel in all three, then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone about him or not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. Again, we have this notion that Jesus's messianism is a secret. And that's usually the way scholars talk about this, the messianic secret. Well, how do we explain this, right? If we're to take it as historical fact, one second, Sheila, right? We take it as historical fact. Aha, it must be that the inner circle knew something that was not able to be proclaimed to everyone. But if we see this as the product not of the time period which is being depicted, but of the generation which is grappling with what do we do now that our leader has been executed? And part of the response is when he's going to come back, he will be the Messiah. Well, think about how effective a model this is. We always knew that he was going to be the Messiah, but he told us to be quiet about it until the right period. Okay? And this is a clever way of maybe retrojecting a later idea onto the past. All along, we really knew it, but he told us to be quiet about it, and that's why we never told you about it back then, and we're only telling you now. Yeah, Sheila, go ahead.
Are these three disciples, did they write the books at the same time?
Well,
no.
So as I'm trying to say, Mark is we don't know, right? We don't have autograph editions, right? Publishing works in a radically different way in the ancient world. I think what I'm trying to present is that Mark is written sometime in the 80s of the first century, and that both Matthew and Luke are written sometime after the year 100 in the second century. So the answer is no. They're written between 50 and 100 years after the events they depict.
Okay, because what's disturbing to me, or what raises the question, is line 20, 30, and 21. They're saying the exact same language. Now I realize it's a translation.
No. And so, but of course, remember, and you're right to point this out, the reason why scholars will argue it's the exact same language is because Mark is the original text. It's written in the 80s. And when Luke writes Luke's gospel and when Matthew writes Matthew's gospel, they have copies of Mark sitting in front of them. And the basic structure of these synoptic gospels, that's why we call them the synoptic gospels, because when you look at them together, so much is the same, right? It seems that the reason why they're the same is because Luke copied from Mark, Matthew copied from Mark, and that's why they're the same. Now, in some places, this is a wonderful example of them. They don't only copy what's in front of them, right? Matthew sees fit to add this entire section here. And we saw that in Luke last time. So it's not as if they're independent eyewitness reports, right? It's if you know how it works when the New York Times and the Washington Post write the same article. It's not because they're prophets; it's because they both stole it from the Associated Press, right? And that's how journalism works, right? And this is how it works in the ancient world.
But it's still very strange because we don't have this in Judaism. I mean, in the Hebrew
We do
Bible,
have this in Judaism. We have it all over the place in the Mishnah and in the Tosefta, where Mishnah.
Talking about whole books like this.
I don't agree with you. First of all, we have it in biblical books. We have portions of Chronicles which match almost exactly portions of Kings, and in Mishnah and Tosefta we have different versions which are almost exactly parallel of the same thing. It happens all the time between the Babylonian Talmud and the Yerushalmi. Happens all the time between various midrash collections and the Yerushalmi. The synoptic problem, and by the way, this is something that enters the academic study of rabbinic texts almost perfectly from the academic study of New Testament texts. Shaya Cohen wrote a very well-received article, I think in the 80s, called The Synoptic Problem in Rabbinic Literature, in which he really seeks to show how this kind of methodology of reading the gospel texts developed by Christian, Protestant, German scholars in the 19th century is really the most important way to use and read rabbinic texts, because so often they displayed, so much is the same. And then when things are a little bit different, trying to explain how it gets that way maybe I'm overstating the case. It's not exactly the same, but in many ways it's very.
In other words, you're saying JEPD.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that, because those are independent sources, right? They're not dependent on one another. Sometimes they share some common ideas. Abraham argued that Sarah was his sister, not his wife, or things like that. But they're not dependent upon each other the same way these are, or the same way texts in the Mishnah or Tosefta are. So it's not exactly the same. It's not exactly the same thing. Okay. Finally, we have a sort of explicit question. Okay, and here these are selections from the so-called trial of Jesus, right, where Jesus is put on trial by the high priest in the temple. Right? Then the high priest said to him, "I put you under oath before the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "You have said so." Isn't this interesting? In Matthew, Jesus seems to refuse to answer the question. Right? Whereas in Mark, I am. Okay, this is really interesting. So what is it that we have these variety of answers? In Luke, he replied, "If I tell you, you will not believe me. And if I question you, you will not answer." Right? And then we see this parallel to Matthew here. Really, it's only in Mark where Jesus is sort of willing to admit under threat of perjury that indeed he is the Messiah. If it's really out there, right? If that's really present from the beginning, why don't we see it? Why don't we see it everywhere? We also have sort of good data, maybe, that suggests that Jesus maybe isn't so much of a messianic figure, okay, in the way that we have been arguing it, and more on this: the end of the world is coming. The end of the world is coming. Right? A number of his disciples said to him, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father." Right? I'm willing to follow you, but I've got a chiyuv. Right? In Jewish parlance, the obligation to bury close relatives is incredibly important. I think most of us, unfortunately, have experienced this, right? At Jewish funerals, the mourners themselves bury the person, right? I remember this at my late grandmother's funeral, even my totally non-observant cousins. And I insisted that no, the gravediggers weren't going to put the dirt on grandma, that we were going to do it ourselves, right? Burying your relatives is among the highest and most important mitzvot. So yes, teacher, I'd love to come follow you, but I have a mitzvah I must do now. Can't you wait? Right? And Jesus says, "Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead." There's no time. Right? The end of the world is coming now. Right? Those things don't apply. We don't have to worry because it's tomorrow, right? Tomorrow, the resurrection of the dead is coming and the resurrected people can bury the dead, right? It's amazing. Okay, let the dead bury their own dead, but as for you, go and proclaim the kingdom of God. So this is not exactly messianism, right? This is prophet of the end of the world right now. It's about to happen. Okay? The other thing that's sort of a problem here, and when I say a problem, I mean a problem for the earliest Christian communities and trying to figure out after Jesus's execution, okay, what do we do now and who was he? Is some of these texts, and Sheila, here's another good example of the synoptic problem, right? Matthew and Luke sometimes look very much alike, and Mark is totally silent on this. And this is why scholars think that in addition to Mark as a source for Matthew and Luke, that Matthew and Luke have a collection of quotes, right, of sayings of Jesus. And in these sayings of Jesus, Jesus seems to be anything but a Davidic military Messiah figure, right? King David is famous mostly for knocking out Goliath with his slingshot, right? He's the war for beating the Philistines, for marshaling the troops and fighting. He's a martial king. Reading from Luke, but I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. This is not how the military Messiah is supposed to act, right? In some ways, it's the opposite of the Davidic military king, right? So how do you square this sort of pacifist ideology with the kind of militant messianism which is so baked into the messianic claim? Okay, and so I'm quoting here explicitly from Fredrickson. How could the image of David the warrior be fit back into memories of Jesus's actual mission? The short answer is it could not be. But the figure of David could be used to describe the lineaments of Jesus's future role and behavior at his deferred, definitive second coming. In the early decades of the first century then, right, and first century, right, these Davidic, thus military traditions began to fill out the expectations of the earliest community. Jesus's military messianic future, when he returned, in the sense would compensate for his Irenic, non-Davidic earthly mission. And the weight of Jesus' Davidic or Davidized future in turn would begin to shape the proclamations backward, affecting and effecting new traditions about Jesus himself. If Jesus would soon reappear as a Davidic Messiah, then he must have been descended from the lineage of David too. And that sort of leads into what we were talking about last week, where we have these two very different Davidic birth stories, right? I got to get a person I know is from Nazareth to not be from Nazareth, because we know the Messiah doesn't come from Nazareth. We know the Messiah has to come from Beit Lechem, which is David's city. And maybe we see here, even in some of the earliest texts, the beginnings of this kind of move, right? Thessalonians is from the 50s. Paul is earlier than the Gospels, okay? For since we trust that Jesus died and rose again, okay, this notion of Jesus's resurrection, not the resurrection that happens at the end of the world, right? Think Ezekiel and things like that, that somehow this preaching of the end of the world is sort of true first in a localized sense, which prefigures the eventual resurrection of everybody, right? That's sort of parallel to this notion of, well, Jesus will be the Davidic Messiah when he returns. Okay, even so, through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep, meaning have died. For this we declare to you by word of the Lord, that we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will not precede those who have fallen asleep. Paul too thinks that the end of the world will happen in his lifetime. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a cry of command. Here we have the Davidic Messiah. When Jesus comes back, he will be the Messiah. With the archangel's call and with the sound of the trumpet of God, right? The shofar is a war instrument. And the dead in Christ will rise first, and then we who are alive shall be caught up in the clouds to meet the Lord of the air. Okay, so seemingly already in the 50s, right, you see the beginnings of this move towards, well, because Jesus in the future will be the Davidic Messiah, to some degree, there's this effort to read that eschatological future onto the past. And so this is basically the claim I've been making for the last hour or so, right? That these texts, while on the one hand preserving some kernels of what the original situation must have been like, are also really reflections of the communities that produced them, right? Who were grappling with this deep, deep, deep problem. How do we keep our communities together? How do we understand what has happened to us, given that instead of the end of the world happening like we assumed, the Romans crucified our leader, and now what? And this ingenious theological move sort of allows this community to maintain its sense of self, and the end of the world is still almost gonna happen, or is about to happen, by means of ever so slightly pushing it off into the future. Okay, so I'll take the screen share away and certainly open it up to questions if people have them.
Rabbi, this is Cheryl Bellamy.
Hi.
Hi. I have a question with respect to the notion of Mark, Luke, and all three, and the Psalm too. They have this nuance of being an introduction of the Trinity. When he says, is that true? It seems to me there's the notion of Christians believing the Trinity, God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, the dove,
yeah, right.
When he says, I will be
to Matthew. Yeah, right. So I think that Trinitarianism, yeah, go ahead.
I'm just asking you, would that be a sense of the Trinity that the Christians still believe in?
Probably, and it's certainly read that way. And you're absolutely right to point out that in iconographic depictions, right, the bird, the dove, is almost always universally used in both Western and Eastern Christian art as the sort of hint that Holy Spirit is going on, right? And the fact that we have that Ruach HaKodesh, Holy Spirit, right, that's happening at the baptism, etc. But I'm not sure, I haven't spoken very much about John yet. Right? For John, Jesus is part of God in this very explicit way, that Jesus is not just the Messiah, but that Jesus is God in some sense, right? Which does not seem to be so present, if at all, in the Synoptics. And this is, I would argue, even a later move to try to articulate who Jesus was / is, but I don't think that it is really present. Certainly not in the earliest texts, and probably not even by the 1st century. This is probably probably in the 3rd century, in the 4th century, sometime when we get these very developed Christological Trinitarian ideas. Yeah, Barry, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I might have missed this. What I have in mind is you are citing verses from the Gospels in particular that bring out the intertextuality between the Tanakh and the New Testament.
Sure.
And the one particular instance that, if you haven't touched on, I'd like you to drill into a little bit. And that's what we have in Luke 4. Where Jesus is in a synagogue, and is reading from Isaiah 61,
right?
And it creates quite a tumult,
right?
And more than saying that the time is coming, there's an interpretation that the time actually has arrived. Right. Now we know the details, everything that happens immediately after that is so extremely dramatic. So why read from Isaiah 61 in particular? And if you could help me better understand the setting of what's presented there in the gospel.
Yeah, I mean, so you caught me a little bit off guard. I didn't prepare the text. I mean, I know what you're talking about, but I don't have an in-depth response. But it is only in Luke, right? And so I think, you know, what we would probably want to look at is sort of when you find something that's really unique to only Matthew or Luke, and they're very, very small, right? The percentages of uniqueness to either Luke or Matthew are pretty small. The parts that they share neither with Mark nor with one another, right? I think most scholars would articulate that this in some way is a unique concern of the community to whom Luke is writing. And maybe what we're seeing about this notion of it's happening now, right, is exactly what's going on now. Why Isaiah 61? I mean, I think we've already seen some of these sections, that Isaiah is incredibly important to these communities. Isaiah is far and away is quoted more often in the New Testament, in the Talmuds, and in the Dead Sea Scrolls more than any other book of the prophets, right? And the fact that all three of these collections are so focused on Isaiah means that people were reading Isaiah in intense ways. It's probably why we have so many copies of Isaiah from Qumran. And so I think this is if you're going to make an argument, if you're making an argument to people who assume that Isaiah is not talking about the ancient past, but talking to me right now and interpreting it is important for understanding what's going on to me right now. Well, it makes sense that that would be the move that Luke is making for that community. Now, exactly who is Luke's community and how is it that Luke's community, a largely Gentile community, right, is reading the Septuagint version of Isaiah so intensely? I mean, that's a good question. But it does seem that there were non-ethnic Judeans who were all over the Roman Empire. Josephus talks about it a great deal, who are sort of attached. They're God-fearers in Josephus's locution, who are not circumcised. They don't consider themselves Jews, right? And yet they have access to Jewish scripture and are reading it in Greek, and therefore are making arguments about how it should be interpreted is the way that all of this works. The Gospels only work if you posit that there are communities out there which already accept largely the canon of Tanakh, as we would call it, in its Septuagint form. Okay, so a little bit of a sort of teaser for next week is how does all of this affect the rabbis, right? If at all. What is the unique rabbinic messianism, and how does the sort of twin messiahs of Jesus of Nazareth and of Bar Kokhba affect the way that rabbinic Judaism will think about the Messiah and messianism? And so we're going to read some passages from early rabbinic texts. We'll look at passages from the Talmud, and then, which, like all Talmudic texts, are weird and wonderful and say a bunch of different contradictory things. And then we'll end with the Rambam, right? Because it's really the Rambam who sort of codifies Jewish messianism in a legal sense, and in the uncensored versions of the Rambam will explicitly talk about Jesus of Nazareth in his section talking about messianism, and he says some interesting things. While Jesus clearly wasn't the Messiah from the Rambam's perspective, the Rambam is sort of intrigued by Jesus and thinks that to some degree both Christianity and Islam are divine in nature, right? And that's in some ways these messianisms, though not Jewish messianisms, are related to Jewish messianism and think sort of help bring close the ultimate redemption, because despite the fact that we have deep disagreements with Christians and Muslims, we also have a lot of areas of agreement: monotheism, basic morality of the Torah, all kinds of things like this, which seem to be prerequisites for a good rabbinic Jewish messianism. And maybe therefore these kinds of texts and ways in which Jews reading the scriptures of others are sort of invitations to dialogue and ways to think about bringing close the redemption. So we'll leave it there. Shabbat Shalom, and I will see you all next week.